The personal views expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show, all the way from London, one of my favorite cities in the world. Mark Bishop. He's the professor of Cognitive Computing Emeritus, Goldsmiths, University of London, and scientific advisor to Fact 360. Welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Well, I'm happy that you agreed to be on the show. I really enjoy your writings and the things that you put out on LinkedIn. Very thought-provoking. And I think, as you've seen with people getting super excited about generative AI, now everyone thinks they're an AI expert, but we actually have AI experts that we can have on the show, like Mark. So if you could please tell me your journey in technology, your things you're interested in, and how you got here, how you became an expert in this field and the work that you do advising people on AI.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. It's a nice question. I think I've got a slightly unusual route in that I don't come from a family that's had a long history of children going to university. So when I went to study for my first degree, which was in cybernetics and computer science, I was very focused on getting a job in industry as soon as that degree was finished. And that's exactly what I did. And I got a very well-paid job and was quite content in my role as a software engineer. But at the time, I was sharing a house with a number of other ex-students, and one of them was started doing a PhD at the university. In my ignorance, I'd never even heard of PhDs before, never mind ever thought of applying for one myself. But Nick, as he was, we'd had some interesting chats. He said, oh, you might want to consider doing this. And around the time I was commuting, I don't know how far it would be in kilometres, but I was commuting about 100 miles daily to my place of work. And as a relatively young 21-year-old, I was probably driving a little faster than I ought to have been. And over that year that I worked, I had three very near escapes of some serious accidents that were entirely my fault. And after the third such incident, that thought about possibly doing a PhD began to raise its head. I thought, maybe it might be fun, so we're going to be a student again. So I went for an interview, and to my amazement, they offered me a funded PhD place at Reading in the Department of Cybernetics. And as a child, I'd read a lot. I was very interested in science fiction. And the idea of building a thing that could think and understand and have feelings was something that had always been kind of dear to my heart. I've read a lot of science fiction stories where this trope is used a lot. And my supervisor, this is going back into the very early 1980s, a guy called Mike Usher. He was very interested in what we now know as neural networks. So he said, Mark, would you like to do a PhD in neural computing? And absolutely, I thought that sounds exactly what I want to do. I'm going to build a model of the brain, and if brains can think, obviously neural networks must be able to think. It's just a matter of getting the right neural network, the right learning algorithms, and a fast enough computer. And Bob's your uncle, we've got a thinking machine. Well, that's what I thought at the start of that PhD program. So I enrolled, and my first shock about 1 year into the grad program was I went to give a talk on my research in the computer science department. If you recall, I was doing my PhD in the cybernetics department, a discipline which incidentally historically is long related to the history of neural computing, with thinkers like Warren McCulloch and Pitts, Frank Rosenblatt, all identifying as cyberneticians. Anyway, so I went to the next door computer science department to give a talk on my early research. And to my astonishment, instead of people being interested, I was met with derision. Literally, the postdocs were literally laughing at me, because this was, I found out afterwards, right at the height of the so-called first AI winter with respect to neural computing. So I was fairly forcefully told, as male postgraduates are often quite wont to do, in no uncertain language, that didn't you know Minsky and Papert showed neural computing was a load of rubbish back in the 60s? What are you doing wasting your time on that? You should join us doing some proper AI research in rule-based systems, which was the approach they were using in the computer science department at that time. Anyway, being a bit of a stubborn old boot, the more they derided my chosen field of study, the more interested in it I became. So I carried on and completed my PhD, which focused on neural computing and what I called anarchic methods of building intelligent systems. And I chose the word because it's the opposite, if you like, of rule-based. If you think of anarchy, a society without rules, I was interested in approaches to building intelligent machines that didn't rely on explicit rules. And the one interesting thing, really, in retrospect, that dropped out of that, well, there were a couple of interesting things that dropped out of the PhD. One was getting a firm grounding in basic neural network theory, which has stood me in great stead. The other was I developed what we now know as the world's first swarm intelligence algorithm, and that's the idea if you model artificial creatures a little bit like bees or ants, you can get some very interesting optimization behavior out of the interactions of lots and lots of very simple entities. And stochastic diffusion search, as we now call it, was the very first swarm intelligence optimization algorithm that was used. So I ended up spending a lot of my professional life Reading and latterly at Goldsmiths, looking at the analysis, the theoretical analysis and the practical applications of this algorithm that I developed as part of my doctoral work. So that's been a large part of my life work, if you like. But then the really big thing, looking back on my career, that happened is that I got exposed to a philosophical argument that kind of undermined the idea that we can build genuinely intelligent machines. And that's what I went to a conference on neural computing at Oxford University. And the conference was memorable for many reasons. The first one, I've never been to an academic conference before when it's been hugely oversubscribed. So the main room, which must have held a couple of thousand, I imagine, was completely full. They had 2 overspill theatres, first and second overspill theatre. And I managed to get into the second overspill theatre, watching proceedings on a big video screen. And what was the reason for the excitement? Well, the reason for the excitement was it was one of the first presentations in the UK of the work by a group from America called the PDP, the Parallel Distributed Processing Group, who'd, in retrospect, we know, had rediscovered an algorithm for training multi-layer neural networks that circumvented some of the criticisms that so elegantly Minsky and Pape outlined in the 1960s in their book, Deceptrons. So this generated a huge amount of interest. And the interest was drawn because, on the one hand, interest in symbolic rule-based systems was fading, in part due to the critiques outlined in the UK, but in the Lytle report, to do with things like combinatorial explosion. And in the other, people, this basic intuition that appeals to so many people, that if we can simulate the brain, we must be able to simulate the mind, and therefore neural computing surely is an interesting area to go. This had never really died away. And so when people heard that the PDP group had got a new learning algorithm that could be used to teach multi-layer neural networks, the excitement was palpable, and delegates came from all over to hear the very first presentations on this. But what was critical for me is also at that meeting, I saw 2 philosophers, Dan Dennett, both American, Dan Dennett and John Searle. And I'd never seen philosophers in the flesh before, coming from an engineering background. And the first thing that shocked me was philosophers can be extremely pugilistic in their exchanges. It was a kind of exchange that I've never seen before. It was very fierce and kind of personal, and I'd just never come across this. It's not what we were used to in engineering conferences. And the second was that they spent a lot of time talking about an argument that John Searle had put out a year or two earlier called the Chinese room argument, which, if it's correct, purports to show that no system, the formal system, i.e. a system that follows a sequence of rules like any computer program effectively, can ever genuinely understand. Searle was defending this position, and Dan Dennett was, as actively as he could, trying to undermine Searle. And I got to grips with the argument, and I thought, wow, I think John Searle's onto something there. Anyway, I sort of let that lie in the background as I finished my PhD, then got first of all some postdoc positions at Reading, and then I eventually got a position on the faculty of the cybernetics department, where I enjoyed a wonderful number of years working with some great people. And in the course of that, I started Reading University at the time. It was allowable to do a master's for free if you were on the faculty of any department. And having had that gentle introduction to philosophy through that exposure to John Searle and Dan Dennett, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if I did a master's in philosophy? So I enrolled on a master's of philosophy, and instead of just doing the compulsory modules as they were, I decided I liked philosophy so much, I would do everything. So I did all the modules in philosophy that I possibly could and really enjoyed it. And in the course of that, got chatting to one of the major philosophers of mine, Professor John Preston, as he is now, and we decided to write a retrospective 21 years after Searle first published The Chinese Room, where we would invite 10 essays from the leading cognitive scientists and 10 from the leading philosophers to debate how well John Searle's Chinese Room argument has stood the test of time. And that book came out in 2002 on Oxford University Press. It was called Views into the Chinese Room, and I contributed a chapter to it in my arrogance. And my work, if you like, Searle's work purports to show that no formal system can ever genuinely understand in the way that humans understand. Effectively, they can't understand at all, if Searle's correct. My contribution to the book showed through a reductio ad absurdum argument called Dancing with Pixies that no formal system or no computational system could ever be conscious, phenomenally conscious, could ever feel the sensation of what it's like to be slapped around the face or see the ineffable red of a rose, unless panpsychism was true. Everything in the world was conscious of every possible experience. For a scientist, that's not a very satisfactory position. So we're led to the other horn of the reductio, and that means to reject the idea that computers can be conscious. So in that book, we examined the Chinese Room. I put forth my argument against why computers can't be conscious. And that led to kind of a second career, if you like, my first career being to develop the stochastic diffusion search swarm intelligence algorithm that was part of my doctoral work. The second approach then became to try and undermine or to argue against the mountain of hype that even in the sort of 90s was there, saying that computers generally understand that one day they will have a mind and these things could be conscious. So I've been sort of kicking against the pricks, if you like, trying to argue against that position for over 35 years now. And there's just a small number of us who take a skeptical line on AI. And it's kind of ironic because in 2010, I was elected to chair the UK Society for AI called the AISB. That's the Association for the Artificial Intelligence and the Simulation of Behaviour, which is the oldest such society in the world and the largest membership such society, certainly in the UK. And I was elected to chair that. So there's a certain irony being the chair of a society devoted to the study of AI from someone who was kind of pretty sceptical about what machines could do. And then I left the society after 4 years, after hosting their most successful conference ever, where my other interest around this time was in advanced cognitive science, and hence how I got the chair at Goldsmiths. And I was very interested in modern cognitive science because it transpires that people who argue very forcibly, it's almost like religiously, in my opinion, that computers really think and can be conscious. They're basing their ideas from a philosophy that started in the 1960s from Hilary Putnam called functionalism. And of course, as we all know, Putnam did an about-face with his ideas about functionalism and most famously in a book called Representation and Reality, where he argues very convincingly that functionalism reduces to behaviorism. And it seems to me strange that people in AI were basing their work on really out-of-date cognitive science, and there was lots of very exciting new cognitive science coming around. To this day interests me, the idea that the mind doesn't float free of the body like functionalists believe it to, but is deeply informed by our body. So for the embodied cognitive scientists, our lived body, our cognition is contingent on the neurons in our brain, if you like, the microtubules in the neurons in the brain in the body, and then the body in our social environment and our physical environment. All those things come together to bring forth our cognition and experience of the world. And it's just nonsense to think we can abstract cognition from the body that we're in. So that's embodied cognitive science, if you like, a hardcore version of it. And then I also got interested in related fields of enactive cognitive science, ecological cognitive science, and embedded cognitive science. So all those things are coming through. And in that 2014 AISB 50th anniversary conference that I hosted before resigning from the society, we tried to focus on those things which were really exciting me. And then after leaving the AISB, I got a firm called Tungsten in the UK offered me at that point in time, what seemed a very large amount of money to set up a research centre in AI at the University of London called TCIDA, Tungsten Centre for Intelligent Data Analytics. And I was given free rein to recruit who I wanted. I had at one time about 12 or 15 people working at the centre, so a moderate-sized centre. It was great for me as an academic because it meant I was able to buy myself out of all teaching, and not that I didn't used to enjoy teaching, but the admin that goes with it can be a pain after a while, and focus entirely on research. So I had a wonderful number of years at the centre until a change of CEO at Tungsten meant that the desire to fund a centre in data analytics was no longer top of their priorities. And once Tungsten withdrew their funding, To my astonishment, all my staff left the university to set up a spin-out to develop some of the ideas we'd been working on in the centre. And that company turned into Fact360, which is the company I still advise now. And then being left as a director of a centre with no staff and no funding, I had a department said, well, you'll have to go back to teaching undergraduate Java or whatever the heck the language was at the time. And I thought, no, that's not for me. I'm going to I'll take early retirement. So at that point in time, I left academia and on an early retirement package, and I've then felt free to work with Fact360. Sadly, around this time, my mum developed advanced Alzheimer's, so I spend a lot of my time caring for my mother these days. But I juggle my duties now between writing academic books. I've got a trilogy coming out on autonomous driving, the first volume of which should be published third quarter of this year. The trilogy is called Driving Intelligence, and the first volume is called The Green Book, Routes to Autonomy. Second volume will be called The Amber Book. You can see where this is going, traffic light theme coming through here. And then the third volume will be The Red Book, where we'll look at the Amber Book looks at some of the problems that have emerged, some of the crashes that have happened with autonomous driving, trying to find out what causes them. And then the third book looks at the philosophical problematics around the very notion of autonomous driving. So that trilogy is almost finished. It's written with a co-author called Gabriel Zibreth. And I keep myself, I've got some other books on the go as well, so I'm quite busy as a writer. And I get asked to give the odd plenary and keynote around the world, which is always nice when that happens as well. So that's, I think, give you as brief as I can make it, a potted history of how I've arrived to be speaking with you guys today.
That is tremendous. Thank you so much for that history. So, as someone who's very steeped in technology and data for many decades, what do you make of all this hype now around generative AI and AI in general? What are your thoughts there?
Well, as you'll have gathered from that somewhat rambling introduction from myself a minute ago, I'm a little bit skeptical. I think these things can be great tools, but when we get people like the Sam Altman and Elon Musk predicting AGI, that's artificial general intelligence, in other words, getting a computer system to be as good or better than human performance in all possible activities, intellectual activities, I'm skeptical that any computational system, let alone large language models or Gen AI, will ever achieve that. And the reasons for my skepticism I outlined in a paper provocatively called Artificial Intelligence is Stupid and Causal Reasoning Won't Fix It. And I use that term stupid very, very precisely. It kind of riffs off the everyday notion. We all think we know what a stupid thing or person is, but actually I'm using it in a very precise philosophical sense. It's definition 3 in the Oxford English Dictionary of the English Language, and that's of a sensus or an insentient entity, what the third notion of what stupid might mean. And it's important to me that, AI systems aren't conscious. In this sense, there's definitely stupid. There's no sentience there. And it's very important for me. There's something that an amoeba has when it negotiates the sugar gradient to find an optimal supply of nutrient for it to live, that has a whole different degree, that is ontologically sentient in a way that a rock and a computer system isn't. And there's a way in which even the simplest thing like an amoeba have a much richer, well, they have an understanding of their environment in the sense that a computer system has no understanding. And to cash what I mean by that out, I can do that in a number of ways. The first way, if you imagine you've got a computer system on a production line that's manufacturing chocolate bars. I don't know whether you like chocolate bars. I certainly do. My daughter does. But imagine they're whizzing past a little camera that's sensing these bars, and you've got a system that's counting them. That system had no more idea it's counting chocolate bars than elephants or space rockets or bananas or anything. It's got no idea it's doing anything. It's just like a glorified calculator. Press one thing and something else happens as a result. It seems to me that all computer systems are like that. The only intrinsic meaning, the only meaning these systems have is when we as humans put a computer system to some use. Now, I can flesh this out for you in a myriad of different ways, but one of the best is by introducing to you the idea of isomorphic computing. Please stop me, by the way, if I'm going off on one and this isn't of interest to your listeners.
No,
But
this is
anyway,
good. This is great.
isomorphic computing is when you have precisely the same source code. So you've got a computer running in a little box, and you've got precisely the same computer program executing, just the way that you wire the outputs of that computer system to the world, you can make it do very different things. So the best example of this that I know of is you can get a program to play what in England we might say is noughts and crosses, but I think in the US you call tic-tac-toe. You can get a computer, any program that will play a tic-tac-toe optimally, I can then use unchanged to play a game called Number Whist, which is a card game. Now, semantically, these are totally different entities. When I play Number Whist with my 11-year-old daughter, she thinks I'm playing Number Whist and she conceives of it, thinks about it in a certain way. When we're playing noughts and crosses, we're doing something totally different. Isn't it weird that exactly the same program, just by wiring the outputs in certain ways, can be used to play both games? So clearly, if that's the case, there's no sense in which this computer can be said to be knowing it's playing Number Whist or tic-tac-toe, because I use the same program can play both, which are ontologically very different experiences for a human. The only meaning of that computation arises when we as humans use that box to play either Number Whist or tic-tac-toe. That's where the meaning is, the interaction of the human and the computer. There's no intrinsic meaning, no observer-independent meaning in the computational box itself. The idea that these things can have any internal idea of meaning and internal genuine semantics about the world just seems a non-starter for so many reasons in my mind. And it also, I noticed the people who tend to argue the contrary position that computer systems do understand, do have semantics, really tend to be very interested in and never grown out. I mean, I used to like science fiction when I was 13 and 14, but thankfully my literary taste has moved on a little bit over the years. And the people that I meet who are most passionate about this have a very rich diet of usually not the best science fiction and have got what with this meme that computation instantiates everything there is about mind, this functionalist idea. So I'm skeptical that Gen AI is going to get us to AGI, and that's not to say it isn't useful. I use Gen AI in my daily workflow every day. As I said in the foreword to the Green Book on driving intelligence, I used it to help me write the books. When I'm writing a paragraph and I get tongue-tied and a big long-winded and I can't think of a nicer way to frame what I want to say, I'll interact with ChatGPT or Copilot or Gemini on a paragraph and see if I can get some ideas as to how to frame that better. I don't see that's anything wrong with that. The book's Gen AI is certainly not writing the book. It's out of my co-authors' ideas that are putting this together. But yeah, throughout the book, on occasion, we've used it, or I've used it certainly, to help me improve the way that I'm framing some quite complicated ideas. Because in the Green Book, we really do delve deep under the hood to show not just how first-gen neural networks worked, which are pretty simple devices these days, but how transformers work, how large language models work, how BERT works, how diffusion systems work, how end-to-end neural network controllers for autonomous vehicles work. So we like to think we've gone under the hood, and that's quite an ask when your audience, you hope to be not just the academic and business specialist in autonomous vehicles and AI, but the generally interested lay man and woman who wants to learn a little about it. So it's quite a challenge to write a very technical book that can be understood by a wide readership. And hopefully we've gone some way to meeting that challenge. But as a result of all those ideas, Gen AI is super useful, but just don't get too excited about what it can do. It's not going to replace all human labor. It might help automate some human labor, certainly. And it certainly won't have a mind to decide it wants to rule the world. That I can say with some certainty.
I agree with that. I don't think AI will ever be sentient in the way that people believe it will be. But I guess for me, the danger is that people will treat it as if it is, right? And so that, to me, that's like a today, right now problem.
It's something I rail against, and I think people in AI have a lot to blame for this, because people tend to use very anthropocentric terms when they're describing these things. Even the very phrase machine learning, seems to me ridiculous. What we have here is an optimization process, to go back to the work I started out doing in my PhD on machine optimization. All that's happening in machine learning is we're optimizing a set of weights on a complex computational system such that it'll perform in a certain way. It's not at all in the same way that humans learn. And I think the use of these terms learning, they load the discussion in a way that people tend to get overly sentimental about computers in the way they might not get so sentimental about a rock.
I think that's true. I think that's true. I want your thoughts on privacy and the tension there between kind of advanced computing like AI and privacy, because and I'll just give you my thoughts. I think it's amazing that you've also studied philosophy. I'm a bit of a philosopher myself, so I totally understand the things that you're talking about. And I think it's, to me, those things, they work together really well. But I think one of the things that we have that's a challenge with privacy is that a lot of things in privacy and data protection are centered around transparency. And I think what a lot of the computing and AI aren't transparent in the way that people may think it may be, which creates a tension. But I want your thoughts.
Well, I think in the UK, until a few years ago, we were very blessed to be part of a wider community called Europe, until for some godforsaken reason, there was a very slight majority in a plebiscite of the population to leave Europe. A huge mistake, in my opinion. But anyway, it is what it is. One of the nice things about being in Europe is that they think pretty carefully about AI and about data. And they produced what I think is an excellent piece of legislation, which the UK still are in alignment with, even though we've now left Europe. And that legislation is called the GDPR. And that gives explicit, in a series of articles, it explicitly references issues around privacy, ownership of personal data, and particularly important, the use of AI to process personal data, particularly insofar as it might relate to decisions of importance around the individual, perhaps career developing decisions, or perhaps heighten an individual for closer attention by the police than they might otherwise be. And in a series of articles, the GDP outlines, I think, some great protections for the rights of the individual there, while still allowing there to be legitimate use of AI and of data, provided these provisions are met. And usually that means the data subject's got to give some form of consent for their data to be used and must be aware that their data is being used. So yeah, I'm very happy that the UK is still in alignment with the GDPR. I think it doesn't solve all the problems around privacy and all the ethical problems that surround that, but it at least it puts it on a firm legal standing in a way that I'm not sure this is the case in the US, but perhaps you can tell me about that in a second. But it's particularly relevant to me in my role as an advisor to FAT 360, because what we do in FAT 360, we process metadata around comms, and typically this is email comms, but it might be telephone comms, it might be WhatsApp messages, can be any exchange of information, to infer signals about organizations, teams, and individuals. And these signals can be used to warn of potential dangers like insider threat when employees might be tempted to go rogue and harm an entity. It can also be used for good reasons. We can identify signals that correlate with bullying, with workplace harassment, with sexual harassment in the workplace. We can highlight when, say, a new management appointee who's perhaps been appointed not by merit but by favoritism, sadly a practice that goes on all too often in my experience. We can flag that perhaps a new appointment to a certain role, that their performance is the system has gone really downhill since X was appointed compared to when the previous role holder was in situ. And we can offer, technology allows companies to provide very interesting analytics on the health of a company to like the board level, so that people on the board can get, unbiased as we can make it, view of what's going on in the company without having recourse to things like pulse surveys, which are the traditional way in which management get a feel for what's going on in the company. You have to have employees fill in forms laboriously every week or every month. You can imagine saying, the sort of questionnaires that say, "Oh, are you happy in your job?" And is your manager great? And after a while, you might try and filling them in honestly initially, but after you've done it the first three or four times, people tend to lose interest in that. Whereas at Fact 360, we collate this data automatically. And because we're only processing the metadata around comms, it's never the case that we're taking a nose into what Mrs. Miggins in management is saying to Fred Bloggs in accounts. We're not interested in that. We don't look at it. It's never touched. So when you're talking to, for example, unions, as I've done many times in the past when we're rolling these systems out, we can focus on the positives for the workforce, the help in giving hard data if there is any abuse going on in a workplace environment, which sadly there sometimes can be. The fact that we're processing metadata, and usually as well in the companies that we work with, the Fact 360, people have signed away effectively their rights for their emails to be processed when they first join the company. So in these situations, the GDPR itself has limited recourse, but we like to go through with the unions and with the workforce the implications of using our software. We think the benefits far outweigh the risks, but then of course I would say that.
I think it's fascinating that you are using metadata in that way. I feel that metadata has the capability, obviously, to grow, be able to be used in ways like, for example, knowing, like, in a privacy or data protection situation, for example, it may be important to know why a particular document or piece of data was collected. So then if it's going to be used for some other purpose, there may be some mechanism to say, hey, wait a minute, you may need to go back to legal, or, this wasn't the intended purpose. But I want your thoughts on metadata in that way.
Mm. Well, and the very first time we fielded our tech with a client, for real, we did an evaluation with the client, our first client. So we're using it in the wild as opposed to just demonstrating it on the Enron corpus, which is what everybody in this commercial world tends to demo their stuff on. The first time we used it in the wild, we were working for a big company to process a lot of phone calls and messages, metadata around these. And within a minute or two of pressing the start button, what was astonishing to me is that without any knowledge of the we were using it here in a post-incident investigation capability. We flagged up 2 or 3 of the key people who their internal and data investigation unit had cause for concern about. So we demonstrated very rapidly that the technology can work. And certainly when we were practicing on the Enron corpus, at the very first time I used the tech on that, because it seems like magic, black magic, when you can use a system that purely processes, the fact that entity A made a communication with entity B at this time and at these places. That's all. And you create a complex telecoms graph embedded in time of these comms that we were able to identify when people in Enron had been promoted without ever looking at the semantics of the messages. When people fell out of the chain of command at Enron, and they actually transpired to be the whistleblowers, we were able to identify these people purely from these signals, and yet we didn't look at a word of the messages that were being processed. So it certainly is a powerful technique. And in fact, our motivation for working in this came from one of my staff at the Centre for Intelligent Data Analytics, read a book by Gordon Welshman, who was one of the people that worked in Hut 6 in World War II to help break the German and Axis codes. And unlike Turing, who's very widely known about Alan Turing in the UK, who was interested in the semantics of what the codes actually said, Welshman was interested in what he called traffic analysis, what we would now call metadata analysis. And the critical thing is, of course, nearly all of Turing's work has long been out of the Official Secrets Act in the UK, so it's in the public domain. Most of Welshman's work still remains covered by the Official Secrets Act. And in fact, he used to have a very senior position in both UK and in American intelligence until that book was published, because in that book, he wrote a page about some of the work he did on traffic analysis. And he hadn't got security clearance to write about that. And even though he just gave a couple of paragraphs in very untechnical terms, just describing the things that we could do with metadata analysis, he lost his entire, he's an old man at this point, and he lost all his security clearance in the States. He was completely ostracized by the intelligence community, and he kind of died a broken-hearted and an unhappy man. It was really sad. But the bottom line is the technology is incredibly powerful, and I don't know for certain, but my intuition, it was probably the tech that was used in part to help track down Osama bin Laden. It's so powerful, and yet most people don't think about it. They're more concerned about what they've said in comms rather than when and where and to whom they've said things. And again, just give a beautiful metaphor that brings this to the fore. It's very hard for me to lie, but that I'm having a conversation with you now, Debbie, on the UK at 4:44 p.m. on Monday, the 21st of July. That's a fact of the matter. Observers can observe that independently. You think of all the little white lies we might have told on a dating site profile, or on our Facebook or our Instagram. I made this most beautiful dinner last night when actually wasn't quite as beautiful as it might have been. We can easily lie about what we say, but things that we do, transactions, are much harder to gain. And that's what gives this technique its power. And that's what underscores the work we do at Fact360.
That's fascinating. I love the fact that you brought up. I didn't know the story you told me about the gentleman who was looking at
Welshman.
metadata,
Yeah.
Welshman, about the signals. I think that's fascinating. And I think it's true that a lot of Turing's work and a lot of what people think about that is around semantics. Very interesting. And this is just a selfish question because this is just my thought, but I want your thoughts here about Turing. I know that a lot of people talk about it, the imitation game, and can computers think? In my view, think what he was trying to say is that can people be fooled in a way that is harmful because they think that something is intelligent? That's kind of my thought.
Well, it's interesting. If I got involved in the UK in the Alan Turing Centenary Committee, and one of our goals therein was to get an official pardon for Turing, because, as I'm sure you're aware, after the work he did in World War II, which undoubtedly helped shorten World War II in breaking the Enigma ciphers and codes, a few years after the end of the war, he was prosecuted for obscene behaviour and chemically castrated. And not long after that, most people believe he took his own life by biting on an apple, incidentally, because the apple itself is something that, as a young gay man, he'd always been interested in the metaphors around an apple, as illustrated, for example, in fairy tales like Snow White. It's interesting that Turing took his own life by biting a cyanide-laced apple. As you may be aware, Turing, his first love was a guy he met at school, a platonic friendship, obviously, but he made a big impact on Turing's life, and Turing was devastated when this guy died. And I think throughout his life, he was kind of wondering what it would be like to speak to an AI that encapsulated some aspects of this guy's behavior. Died. And again, coincidentally, we can actually do this now with ChatGPT. I've known one of my academic friends, Professor Luciano Floridi, who's trained a chatbot on all Luciano's body of philosophical work, which is quite a lot because Luciano invented the philosophy of information. He's quite a big name in philosophy. And it's just incredible now. You can interact with this chatbot, and it's like you're talking to Luciano. It is kind of interesting in getting the chatbot's ideas on aspects of Luciano's work in the philosophy of information. So I think Turing was thinking about issues around this. My own belief from reading, not all, but a fair proportion of Turing's output, is that he was caught between, on the one hand, his work in the paper on computable numbers from 1936, where he looked at non-computable decision problems in computer science, the most famous of which is what we call the halting problem, which you might be aware of. Just for your audience, the halting problem, in simple terms, says, can we write a general purpose program that will take another program as input and some data to that other program and tell you whether that other program will terminate given that input, given that data as input. Transpires you can't write a general purpose program to solve that. And there's a host of other problems, decision problems, that you can't write computational solutions for. So that was something, and people have speculated that after, if you look back at the work of Kurt Gödel, whose work intimately is related to Turing's work on computability, Gödel famously began to think that there was something non-computational about the mind. And some people have wondered whether Turing was thinking that. But I think, looking at his wider writings and his radio broadcasts, my own view is that Turing did believe that the essence of the mind could be encapsulated by a computer program. He took a different view to me. So even though Turing remains, for me, one of my intellectual heroes, I think we probably would differ on our ideas about whether computers really can be said to think. Again, you referred to the famous paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which starts off with a question, not altogether rhetorical. I want to consider the question, can a machine think? And then he goes on to say, well, this is a bit too vague and we don't know what we mean by that. I'm going to replace that by a practical process. And if we say that a computer can pass this process, which we now know as the Turing test, and again, if any of you readers haven't come across this, that process basically says, let's just unwind this a little bit further. The Turing test was based on an imagined Victorian-esque parlour game that Turing reflected on, where he imagined being in an old Victorian house in the UK, where you had a man go in one room and a woman go in another, and then a set of interrogators. By the way, I played this game with my master students many times when I used to teach at Goldsmiths, and it's actually very difficult to play and win at. So you got a man in one room, a woman in another, and a set of either one or more interrogators outside of those two rooms. And the interrogator, by passing a question on paper through a letterbox in the door to both the man and the woman, has got to work out which room holds the man and which room holds the woman purely by their answers. And their answers have to be typed, so you can't infer anything by the style in which the answers are written. They're just looking at the words that have been typed on a paper. Can you reliably do that? Well, Turing said, well, if you replace one of these people, say you replace the guy with a computer, can the interrogator correctly identify which room has the human and which has the computer as often as we could determine which room holds the man and which room holds the woman in the imitation game? If you can do that, if by putting a computer in that room, the computer can perform at the level that you can't do any better than determining the imitation game, then we say of that computer that it's passed the Turing test. And Turing famously imagined that we would get computers that would do that by the year 2000. Well, it took a few years more than Turing imagined, but I think most people would agree that the best chatbots now can certainly do pretty well at Turing's test, as a so-called test.
Very good, very good. Well, if it were the world according to you, Mark, and we did everything you said, what would be your wish for privacy, AI, or technology, computing, anywhere in the world, whether that be human behavior, technology, or regulation?
Well, it kind of saddens me now that the tech bros are investing so much money. I mean, we're talking about Meta building a data server farm that'll be the size of Manhattan. Just think about that for a minute. A factory containing servers the size of Manhattan. Not just one of the sites he wants to develop. The amount of energy that we're talking about, it's going to be soon the amount of energy used by servers, data centers around the world will be the same as the amount used in Japan. So a country the size of Japan. And in the short term, a lot of this extra energy is being met by burning fossil fuels. My own opinion is I've been very strongly swayed by the evidence of global warming and the thought of having to burn more fossil fuels to fulfill the tech bros' whims that we might build an artificial general intelligence system is just obscene. And so I find the waste of resources obscene. The energy, when you think of people living in energy poverty around the world, and yet we're throwing energy at these obscene centers, it just makes my heart really sad. You can do an awful lot of good work in AI with a computer that fits on your desktop. You don't need a computer the size of Manhattan to do interesting things in AI. People have fancified what's called the scaling law. People thought, well, if ChatGPT 3 was better than ChatGPT 2, and if 4 was better than 3, and we had tens of billions more neurons in 3 than 2, and same for 4 than 3, then if we just simulate more neurons, we're bound to get this intelligence explosion. It's a nonsense. No matter how high, you think about trying to get to the moon. No matter how high the tree, you'll never get to the moon by climbing up a tree. And equally well, you ain't going to get AGI by building larger and larger data centers. It just ain't going to happen, man. So stop wasting the money and the planet's resources on these obscene fantasies. That would be my wish.
That's a great wish. That's a great wish. Oh my gosh. Well, this is so enlightening. Thank you so much for being here. I could talk to you for hours. This is amazing. And so anyone, please do follow Mark on LinkedIn. I love the things that you post and the things that you write. And I was really, really happy that you agreed to do this show. And I know that the audience will love it as much as I do.
Well, thank you for your kindness in inviting me.
Yeah, well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.